Good afternoon. My name is Kevin Ring. I'm president of FAMM. Welcome to another edition of our Heart to Heart series. Today we're going to talk about a really important topic, prison oversight. And I want to start by giving a little background of FAMM's interest in this topic, because for 25 years, FAMM was focused on sentencing reform primarily. And, you know, we're not a group, we are a group that's committed to safely decarcerating our prisons and jails. We think we lock up too many people for too long, and we don't give them ways to get out. And so we want to reduce the prison population in this country. But what we have found is that not everybody agrees with us. And so while we are fighting to reduce the prison population, we want to make sure that those who are trapped in our prisons are treated humanely and with dignity, that they're safe, that they are fed, that they have opportunities to rehabilitate themselves, and to get programming that they need. And so we started looking in the prisons and hearing from families that the conditions were so bad that we couldn't wait until we had convinced every lawmaker in the country to reduce the prison population. We couldn't allow people who were sitting inside right now to suffer unnecessarily. And so we began working on prison oversight. And one of the campaigns we did to launch that was a Visit a Prison campaign that was focused on getting lawmakers around the country to visit prisons or jails in their jurisdiction, not only to see the conditions, but to meet the people who were there so that they could see the types of people that we're locking up and for how long we're locking them up. And that is something we want to continue to do. It's not because we want Norway's prisons or Sweden's prisons and these facilities you see on 60 Minutes where they're so much nicer than America's jails and prisons. We don't seek that for 2 million Americans. We seek a smaller prison population. But there has got to be a baseline of treatment and respect and dignity that's accorded to people in our prisons. And so that's what our oversight mission is about. Unfortunately, our prisons are some of the darkest places in our society. Their oversight is not allowed, and outsiders are not allowed in to inspect these prisons. And so we're focused on making sure that we can get independent oversight so that there is some accountability to taxpayers and to families for what happens in our prisons. And so that's why today I'm so glad to have the panel that we have. I'm going to introduce them briefly now and then ask them to talk. First is Professor Michelle Deich of the University of Texas. She is, I call her the godmother of prison oversight. She has written extensively on this topic. She has advised state and local governments on how to do this correctly. And so we're really honored that she's joining us. Jennifer Vollen-Katz is the executive director of the John Howard Association, our friends in Illinois, who perform a type of oversight that I want her to talk about. And then Lillian Koppas, who is our friend, the president of Arizona Start Project, which is a group that helps families with incarcerated loved ones advocate for prison and sentencing reform. So we're glad to have you all here. And I wanted to start with you, Michelle, to talk about, just give an opening about what is prison oversight? What do we mean when we talk about that?
Sure. Well, Kevin, you started out by saying that prisons are incredibly dark places, and that's right. These are some of the most opaque institutions in our society. And anytime you have institutions that are closed and yet are responsible for the care and well-being and have total control over the lives of the people inside, you need some way of shining a light on what's happening to just bring transparency to that. And that's what oversight is about. Now, oversight is not a term of art. It's really an umbrella concept that it includes a lot of different functions, everything from legislative oversight to the role that the courts play, to the role that the media plays, to the role that accreditation plays. But the kind of oversight that I want to talk about today and that we're all interested in is what we call monitoring or inspections. And the idea is that there should be an independent, typically governmental entity, but sometimes a nonprofit, such as the John Howard Association that Jenny will be talking about. But this independent entity has a right of access to the facilities where they go in and report on the conditions of confinement and how people inside those facilities are being treated. So by getting that access and by writing reports about it, they are shining a light on what's happening to people inside.
Sorry, I had my mic off. Why should people care? I mean, unless you have a loved one in prison, why should people care what's happening in the prisons, and why should we pay for that?
Well, first of all, this is what's being done in our names. We need to care about what's happening in our names. But it's a very costly enterprise, what's going on. We're spending billions and billions in every state on what's happening inside our prisons and jails. And beyond that, these are people, 95% of them are coming back to our communities, and they're coming out worse than they were when they went in. We need to find out what's happening to them, what's making them worse, and how we can all work together to improve that.
Yeah. All right, Jennifer. Tell us about the John Howard Association and sort of what type of oversight are you able to do? What aren't you able to do? And how is it working?
Sure. First of all, Kevin, thank you so much for convening this important conversation and for including me in it. So the John Howard Association is a statewide organization in Illinois. We've been around for 120 years. We are not-for-profit, independent, nonpartisan, and we are an oversight group, a citizen oversight group. For 120 years, we've been going into the Illinois prisons to monitor for conditions of confinement, to learn about the treatment that the people who are incarcerated are receiving. We walk through the facilities, we go into all the different units, we talk to people who are incarcerated, we talk to correctional staff, we sit down with administrators, do our best to collect as much data and information as well as the perceptions and experiences of those who are incarcerated so that we can be that light that Michelle was talking about, exposing what's happening inside our prisons. And the reason for this, our mission is to help promote a prison system in Illinois that is much smaller, humane, fair, and safe. And we're a great distance from all of those things. But the other function we serve is to be a vehicle to bring the voices from inside out. That in order to include the concerns of the people who are incarcerated into the conversation, both macro and micro when it comes to system change, but also very specific correctional policy changes that are needed. We believe that those who are experiencing incarceration must be at the table. And since physically that's not possible, we bring that information into the conversation so that the real concerns are being addressed and included.
When we did our Visit a Prison campaign, I know we talked to you about that, and you guys were, pushing that out as well. What do you think people who don't know a lot about this would learn from going into a prison? People who work with you, I mean, maybe they're new. Like, what do they say? I didn't know that. I wouldn't have known that hadn't I not, visited and gone inside.
So I would say what I hear most frequently from people that join us on visits who have never been to prison and don't have a loved one in prison, so they have very little experience with anything related to incarceration, is number one, wow, those people, and by those people, they mean the people who are incarcerated, they're just like me. They are amazed at the humanity that they see in prisons, that the people they speak to are people with hopes and dreams and loved ones just like them. So they are moved by the fact that these are not, violent monsters, that these are not the sort of pictures they've had painted publicly of the people who are in prison. These are people, and these are part of people's, people that are part of families. And the other thing people notice is how harsh the conditions are. They are, particularly when we leave the maximum security prisons in Illinois, which are all very old and falling apart and really human rights violations in and of themselves, they are shocked and appalled by the physical conditions they see these people living in.
Yeah, well said. Lillian, this is personal to you, and you have a loved one inside, and now you run a group that is dedicated to changing the laws and helping people advocate. What do you see from Arizona? I mean, Arizona is just, it's been in the news a lot because, as we know, they have a lot of problems. But what do families' concerns about, having a loved one inside?
Yes, Kevin, thank you for having me here. I'm very excited and happy to have this opportunity. In Arizona, prison facilities are not safe for our loved ones or for their own staff. A graphic example of that is the Lewis prison locks scandal. We have 2 escapes, almost 12,000 positive cases of COVID-19, 53 deaths attributed to the pandemic, and at least 3 people have died by suicide. Millions of dollars in penalties imposed by a judge due to the ADCRR failure to provide adequate medical care to our loved ones. The last scandal is $23 million spent in software unable to perform basic computation of sentences. Staff that is afraid of retaliation needed to come out as whistleblowers to let community know of the prison system failures. And the list can go on and on. So we as families believe that prison oversight is important because our loved ones in prison, we need to make sure that they are safe, and not only our loved ones, but also the staff that works in the Arizona prisons.
Yeah, and one aspect of prison oversight from our perspective is the inspection, and we'll talk more about monitoring, but also for families to be able to have a little more transparency and get information from the prison system. So can you talk a little bit about your ability, as the loved one of an incarcerated individual, being able to find out what's going on and getting accurate information and timely information about conditions or programming or things like that from the prison? How do you find out anything?
Well, in our Group The Start project, we often hear from families how they struggle to get information about their loved ones in prison. And I can share a personal story to you. In 2013, my husband was brutally attacked in prison, and he was taken to the hospital. And even though I was his emergency contact, prison never contacted me to let me know that he was taken to the hospital with life-threatening injuries. It was not until I showed up a weekend for a visit that the officer informed me that my husband was in the hospital. I started making phone calls, doing everything the prison would have told me to do in order to get information about my husband's health conditions, but they never returned my calls. It was not until I did my own research that I was able to find out where my husband was admitted, and I simply showed up in the hospital to try to find out how he was doing. So families struggle really much to get information, and what is very frustrating is that even though we do everything we are asked to do, the system is not providing the information we request. So the Arizona Department of Corrections has a department called Constituent Services, where we are supposed to call to get information about our loved ones. And what happens there is that you call and you continually get only a voicemail to leave a voicemail prompt. So what we do is you leave a voicemail, and after days and days of calling and calling, they finally return the call to probably not tell you exactly what is going on with your loved one. So you are relying on some other families who live close to your loved one to let you know what's going on. So that is one of the main problems that families in Arizona are facing, the lack of communication. When your loved one is in trouble, or when your loved one is taken to the hospital, or simply just if you want to ask them to go check on them to see if they are okay when you haven't heard from them in weeks.
I usually don't take questions this early, but we got a question that I want to ask you, Lillian, because I think I've heard you answer this question before, and that is for the family members who are watching, who have a loved one in prison. They worry about retribution if they call or they complain and they stand up. What would you say to the? I mean, we hear that all the time, and sometimes it's just rumor and people are worried about it, and it may not be the case, but you don't always know. What would you say to people who are worried about that?
Unfortunately, retaliation is very real in the Arizona prison system. We all families are afraid of our loved ones being retaliated, but I believe there's no room for fear now. We need to be brave enough most of the families in Arizona, we know what's going on in there and how unfair the situation is, how they are mistreated. So right now, it's not the time to stay silent. We as families need to get together and advocate. We need to be the change that we want to see, and we need to put our fear aside, because it's not time. We know we have so much information to be silent. So it is the time that we as family members get together and advocate for our loved ones.
Yeah, really, I wanted people to hear that because I think it is really important. I mean, I know the fear about retaliation, but we're not going to get change if people are quiet. And I think sometimes the system banks on that. Michelle, I want to ask you, I mean, what role can sort of this, not customer service, but sort of family interaction play in a good oversight system? I mean, does that need to be part of it?
Sure, absolutely. I think it's, as Lillian said so forcefully, families have nowhere to go, and people who are incarcerated don't have somewhere to complain that feels safe to them. And while I don't believe that an oversight body should become a replacement for the grievance system, I do think it should be a place that can take in the complaints, the concerns of families, of people who are incarcerated, and they can look into those, again, not to investigate every complaint, but they certainly can look for systemic patterns in those complaints and work with the agency to address those kinds of issues.
And talk about how oversight can hear directly from impacted people and even from officers. What is the access that you recommend that they have so that they are in the facilities and getting this information independently?
So there's multiple forms of access. First of all, by having what we call golden key access, it means that the oversight representatives can go anywhere in the facility at any time without prior notification to the agency. They can talk to anybody confidentially, anyone who's incarcerated, any staff member. They can look at any documentation, videos, files, logs, etc. Beyond that, there should be some kind of hotline set up so that people can call out, and a place where they can write and where they can send confidential communications. It's very important that any statute that sets this up prohibits any retaliation against any staff member or any incarcerated person who cooperates with or shares information with the oversight body as well.
Jenny, what do you guys have for access in Illinois?
So our access is request. We do not have golden key access. So remember, we are not legislatively mandated. Right. We are completely independent, which has pluses and minuses. On the plus side, we're wholly independent, and we call it like we see it, and we say what we think is right. We are not constrained by any political forces, and that can have benefit. On the other hand, we have no legislative authority, so little recourse when we are denied information. We've never actually been denied a visit, and I'm knocking on wood as I say that. But we come, we request visits, but they've got to be approved by our Department of Corrections. And so it is far from golden key access, and we're well aware of the things that get cleaned up before we come. So there's definitely some drawbacks to it. And we would certainly never advocate that independent oversight in and of itself is enough. As Michelle pointed out, oversight's an umbrella. And under that, there should be a lot of different mechanisms at work inside every prison. There should be an ombudsman's office. There should be a functional grievance system. There should be inspections and monitoring. I mean, you should, ideally, you're both addressing individual complaints and concerns, and there's authority to investigate and report on that, and a public obligation to report on that. And then there's also system oversight that's more about inspection and monitoring. So we're a little bit of a fusion of both, with a lot more emphasis on the monitoring and inspection, because that's the capacity we have and the ability we have. We don't have the authority, the access, the ability to be an ombudsman, and we don't have one of those for our correctional department here in Illinois. But I wanted to touch on something that both Lillian and Michelle brought up that I think is hugely important when you talk about retaliation. The reality is that's what oversight can combat. The more you increase transparency, the more you can catch things like that. And that transparency has to be system-wide. It has to include not only the things we've all been talking about, but things like staff discipline. You know, we as a society, we as citizens should be able to see what it is our departments of corrections are doing, how they're behaving. And we should be able to see that from all angles. And that's one check against retaliation. It's certainly not a perfect response, but it is a step towards making that, you know, something that can be inspected and responded to.
What do you guys get called about when somebody requests you to come visit? What are they usually asking for? Why?
So we don't, well, we get a lot of, so we are a privileged mail recipient. We do exist in the Illinois Administrative Code as a privileged mail recipient. And the idea behind that was to create sort of an outside reporter. Most people, frankly, don't use us that way. They share complaints and information. We really use that to fuel our monitoring work. You know, that tells us where are the issues? Are they system-wide? Are they specific to this prison? Are they specific to this region? They help us know where to go and what questions to ask. We hear a lot from families and loved ones of people who are incarcerated. Sometimes they're about system-wide issues. Sometimes they're very specific to their loved one. We're less effective, frankly, in resolving individual issues. But the other thing is, we hear from staff and administrators. You know, there are many administrators who will pull us aside and say, like, look, this is a real problem. And certainly some of that is politically astute. It's a way in which to increase resources when they need them. They know that if we see a problem and resources are needed to address it, we'll advocate for that. We may be coming at it from different perspectives, but we're drawing the same conclusion. And, you know, we also get what I like, you know, what I call the midnight voicemail, right? That's left in our office, that's a staff person. I mean, I've had people identify themselves as nurses inside prisons in tears saying, the treatment is so awful, and I don't know if I should stay because I'm the only one who cares, or if I should leave because I can't bear to see, you know, this anymore and how the system works. So we do hear from the people who work inside our prisons with their concerns as well. Not as frequently as people who are incarcerated, but we do get that information as well.
Michelle, what do you think? What's the reluctance to having independent oversight? Because it's a fight everywhere that we try to establish this. And like Jenny's group's been around for, like she said, over 100 years. If they were trying to start today, it would probably be hard to do. And we're finding that in our fights in Arizona and Florida. What's the resistance? What's the reluctance to have oversight of our prisons?
Well, I think that there's a natural reluctance on the part of any entity, take prisons out of it, to have someone inspecting you or checking up on you in some way. And the problem is that, first of all, prisons tend to be like the only entities in our society that don't get that. Think about it. Schools, banks, nursing homes, mines, any entity out there usually has some kind of check or balance on it. So it may be natural to be reluctant, but it's also completely appropriate to expect that of our government agencies. But beyond that, I think that the concern is that oversight becomes a game of gotcha, where the oversight body is in there to try to find everything that's wrong and to point it out and make heads roll. And I think that that's absolutely not the right way to think about oversight. Part of the problem is that oversight tends to get set up at a time when things are really bad, but that it shouldn't be. It should exist even for the best agencies. A Norwegian prison needs oversight, and it has oversight. The idea is that any organization, any agency, any institution, facility can be better than it is. Oversight is a way of using transparency and bringing best practices to bear on what's happening so that that organization can lift itself up and become better than it was. It's not about trying to assign blame. It's about trying to improve. So with that understanding, I think most agencies tend to recognize that there are benefits that accrue to them from accepting this concept.
Yeah, I want to bring up one issue that we've heard come up. I mean, I don't think it gets into the weeds too much, but the virtue of independent oversight versus in Arizona, Lillian, during the debate over the bill that's moving through the legislature now, there was talk about having nonprofit groups do it or activist groups do the oversight. And what we heard in some conversations with corrections officers was that they'd be more inclined to support oversight if they knew it was an independent body doing it, that they're just afraid you're going to have people come in who are just going to sort of substantiate all the things that the people in prison are saying, and so they're going to be the bad guys, as you say. Jenny, do you guys have that issue? I mean, how are you seen, and is that an issue?
Sure. Well, I mean, of course, it's how are we seen, and how do we see ourselves?
Yeah.
I hope we're seen the way we see ourselves, which is nonpartisan and independent. And part of that for us means, look, to be really honest, we catch it from all sides, right? We have people who are in prison who are upset about something and say, oh, you work with the department, you're part of the department, you don't care about us. And we've got the department constantly telling us, you only listen to what the people who are incarcerated say. You don't, it's a very fine line to walk. It's a difficult balance. One of the ways we manage that is we work very hard to understand operations. We work very hard to learn from administrators and staff to understand what goes on inside. We try to collect as much information as we can. We're constantly pushing for more data to be made publicly available on the part of the department. We survey both the incarcerated population and correctional staff to try and get as much input from the people in the system as we can. The reality is we live in a very partisan day and age, and it's very hard for anyone. If people don't agree with you, the first thing they're going to do is attack your independence. So, I think it's a real challenge. But what I'll say is, I don't think there's any one right way of oversight. I think in the ideal world, you have multiple layers of it. We are part of a group that's pushing to create an official office of correctional ombudsman in Illinois. And people have said to me, aren't you afraid that's going to put you out of work? First of all, I would love to be put out of work, okay? I would love to not be needed. But second of all, the answer is absolutely not. There is room for all kinds of oversight. And I think in an ideal world or in a better world, we have more forms of that in every single prison because they serve different functions. They can accomplish different goals. And I think, that's what's important. But it's very hard to be perceived as independent, even when, that is your goal and you believe your processes reflect that. And some of that has always been true. And I think some of that is very much heightened in the times we're living in.
Yeah. Lillian, I want to ask you, I think some people think that, and surely sometimes, as Michelle said, oversight's born out of scandal. Something happens and then you say, okay, we need to oversight. And there's something maybe that an officer does, like in Florida, where you have this awful, history of sexual assault. But it really isn't, it's not trying to go after officers. I mean, and so many times, COVID being a perfect example, I thought officers and the people who are incarcerated were on the same side of that issue. They all wanted to be safe. And I think even families understand that, because if you've been incarcerated, you always had a guard or two that were good and they helped, and then there were bad ones. So it's like in the rest of life, there's good and bad. But I mean, what would you say to like officers who are trying to convince that, that their interests are aligned, right? That like you care about your loved one, but it's not, as Michelle says, a gotcha game. I mean, how do we convince people that we see them as part of the reason and we want to keep them safe as well?
It is hard to convince them that we also care about staff. But when we speak about oversight, as we have heard, is about the safety of the people that lives in prisons and who works in prisons. So we care about the staff also, and we believe that we need to work harder to make them understand that our work and all the work that we do is going towards getting prison conditions better, not only for the incarcerated people but also for the staff. Because as families, we want to live our lives knowing that our loved ones in prisons are safe. But in order for that to happen, also staff needs to be treated well. It needs to be okay. Our loved ones we would love to see that they are being well fed, that they are being medically treated. But the most importantly, we want to know that there is a trustworthy organism that we can go to if things are not going well inside. We want, for example, to be able to enjoy a meal knowing that our loved ones are being well fed, and which is personally, it's something that I haven't been able to get rid of. Every time I sit on my dining table and I have a meal with the family, my first thought is always, is my husband eating well today? How are they feeding him today? So it goes together. Staff needs to be treated well for them to treat appropriate our loved ones. And I believe we have a long road to go in order to make them understand that staff is important for all the advocacy groups and all the nonprofits that are right now working in Arizona to get prison conditions better and to get the oversight bill passed in the legislature.
Yeah, and I was just saying, I mean, when the prisons are short-staffed, or the officers aren't trained well, or paid well, or overworked, that hurts families. I mean, that hurts the people inside. So, no one wants to be the prison family that's fighting for more corrections officers or higher pay, but they realize that the safety of their loved ones depends on that. And so again, I just think their interests are aligned more than that. Can you mention, because I know the bill in Arizona is up today, just tell people how they can get involved if they want to, because we really do need people to take action, and just a little bit about what we're hoping to accomplish there.
Yes, of course. There's many people, many things that we can do as family members of loved ones in prison. The first one that I will say is to get educated. Get as much information as you can about the conditions. Read articles. Try to get together with other impacted family members. Join Facebook groups. Join organizations. But something that we all can do right now today, right after this meeting is over, is we can get our phones and just text the word oversight to the number 21333, and we are going to be prompt to contact our legislatures and our legislators in order to give the bill an opportunity, the oversight bill that is going on right now in the legislature. So we have an opportunity. I remember 2 years ago, it was the last day of July, we had a meeting in Phoenix Public Library where Representative Blackman was there. And it was the very first time that we started speaking about oversight. So oversight is not just a conversation now. It's real, and it is in the state capitol being spoken about. So we as advocates and family members need to get our phones right now and text the word oversight to the number 21333.
Thank you. If you're in Arizona, please do that, because that bill is on the floor in the House today. We need to get it out and then fight it out in the Senate. Michelle, a lot of legislatures are trying to balance their budget, or they're just otherwise fiscally conservative, and they say, we don't have the money to pay for some new bureaucracy to oversee prisons. These people we don't care about anyway. So what do you say to the argument about the cost?
I would say they can't afford not to do this. So many of these, first of all, prisons, as I mentioned, are costing billions of dollars a year in the budget. And they are also costing a whole lot of other money in the form of lawsuits. We are spending tons of money, taxpayer money, to pay for poor health care or brutality that happens, or use of force, or other kinds of physical conditions that lead to harm on the part of people who are incarcerated. So we need to recognize that having an independent oversight body, first of all, it's a drop in the bucket financially, 0.00 something % of the budget of a corrections agency. It's going to save money over and over again. It's going to pay for itself easily by the savings in lawsuits and such that it can prevent.
You want to comment on that, Jen?
No, I just to agree with Michelle. I mean,
Yeah.
that's absolutely right. It is offset a million times by the cost of litigation that we experience, and why wait till the bad things happen and we have to pay for them in terms of legal costs, as opposed to nipping them in the bud, creating better practices, and keeping everybody safe. And I want to commend Lillian for making the case so well, as to why the interests of the people that work in prison are really aligned with those who live in prison. We know a lot of things about what helps inside prison environments to keep people safe and to increase humane treatment. For instance, we know that the more programming there is, the better off everybody is. The fewer the issues around behavior, the fewer incidents that require discipline and response. The more people are kept happy, the better they're treated, the more humanity that's in evidence, the better off everybody is. And that's both the people that are incarcerated and the people who work in the prisons.
Yeah, can I ask you a question? Came in. This is a little bit specific, Jenny, but somebody asked, and I just want to know what your advice is if somebody said this to you. Is what if the staff, like what if a person inside is having problem with a staff or administrator? What do you tell people to do? I mean, they do worry about retribution and stuff.
It's a
What's-
really
yeah.
hard question. I mean, the first thing we always ask is if we have their permission to intercede. We would never act independently and use somebody's specific, information for fear that we would make their situation worse, or, even if they just perceived that they'd be made worse off, that's certainly not something we would risk. It's a really hard question. Certainly we hear it more related to staff than administrators. And one of the first things we would do is look through our records to see if we've heard about that particular person before. And this is where having, an agency that is staffed and resourced, collecting data and tracking data is quite useful, because then you could begin to see patterns and history. Is this a staff person people have complained about before? What did those complaints look like? Do those complaints follow the different facilities, that person has been working at? So, what we would really do is talk to the person about their concerns and first get their permission about what level of intervention we can provide. And with their permission, we would go talk, to the relevant administrator. We'd likely go to an administrator who supervises that staff person, not directly to the staff person. And I will say that those are areas where we've had some success. Sometimes it's enough to know you're being watched. Sometimes it is enough to know that someone outside the system is saying, hey, we saw that or we heard that and that's not okay, to get people to change their behavior. But we don't have the authority to intercede, and we don't have the ability to investigate. So we're really fairly limited in what we can do in individual situations. What we can do that's probably more, what we can do with that information that will serve the system best, although not answer the immediate situation, is to track this information, keep an eye on it, make a point of visiting that prison, show up at that prison more often, ask more questions, and let them know that this is something we're aware of and concerned about.
Michelle, is anybody doing this well? I mean, are there state systems that are doing it? I mean, at least Jenny, they've got some access, so that's got to be helpful for folks in Illinois. When you look at the states overall, what works?
So, first of all, the U.S. is way behind the rest of the Western world on this front. So there are only roughly 15, 16, 17 states or so that have an independent oversight body of some kind. They're not all equally resourced or what have you. So there are weaknesses and strengths to various models. But back in 2008, the American Bar Association developed a policy resolution that spelled out, first of all, the need for every jurisdiction to develop an independent oversight body. And it set out what the essential elements are for effective oversight. Since that resolution was passed, there have been a few states that have created oversight bodies, most notably the one in Washington state. And the reason I mention this is because the Washington state legislature really looked to that ABA policy to try to make sure that the statute incorporated most of those essential elements. So the Washington state model, it's an Office of Correctional Ombudsman, is a particularly good model. And a lot of the bills that are being proposed around the country right now, in Arizona, in New Jersey recently did, in
Virginia.
Florida, Virginia, a lot of those try to follow that that model. And Texas as well is trying to do something.
Yeah. Okay, let me just say the other question. Well, people ask us about books that they can read on this. Michelle, whenever I need to find writing on this, I go to your webpage. And I read everything you've written on this. But, I mean, are there any books, or if not, how can people read your writings on this?
Well, and actually hopefully within days, there will be a new publication coming out, and it'll be on my website. I will send it to you, Kevin, and hopefully you can help get it out to the world. But it is on the current status of prison and jail oversight in the United States, looking around the country. Where does it exist? What should exist, et cetera. So that would be the best thing I would recommend. It's the most up to date. I have other publications that spell out. One of my articles is called Distinguishing the Various Functions of Independent Oversight. And that spells out what is oversight? What does it look like? What are we talking about here? And I have a 50-state inventory of oversight models, but that's getting a little bit dated. So this new one will be a little more relevant.
Yes, on behalf of the country, please update that. So in your free time, I'm happy to say, as you mentioned, that there are bills being introduced. New Jersey just passed something. New York State, the Correctional Association of New York, just got better access. Representative Patrick Hope in Virginia introduced a good bill. Walt Blackman's pushing one in Arizona. So I think we're seeing some momentum. Diane Hart in Florida, Representative Hart. So I'm glad to see some momentum here. And I feel like the more we talk about this, then every day there's another scandal that justifies the need for oversight. And it's not just mistreatment of people inside. It's escapes. It's, faulty equipment or dilapidated facilities in Alabama, where the U.S. Justice Department looked at their men's prisons and found them in constitutional violation, and they're now investigating Mississippi's. I mean, one thing I think is a threat for these state systems is that the federal government is looking at them. And if they get invited to look at their state systems, I don't know how many can survive scrutiny. Mm-hmm. What is that a threat, Michelle? I mean,
It certainly is a concern. On the other hand, the federal the U.S. Department of Justice doesn't have the resources to look everywhere.
Yeah.
And again, I am reluctant to rely on that, because that is only when things have hit rock bottom.
Yeah.
And the whole idea of the oversight that we're talking about here, it's about prevention. Yeah. And I can't emphasize that enough. Doing preventive monitoring of conditions will keep things from getting to the point where the Justice Department gets involved or where lawsuits get filed.
Jenny, do you have anything to say about that? Because I've heard Michelle make that point before, and I really do like it, which is, this is preventative. I mean, there shouldn't have to be anything wrong. This is just human nature, right? Like, no oversight is a bad thing. They say sunlight's the best disinfectant, and prisons are the darkest place on the planet. We put them in remote places. We don't let the press in. We don't let visitors in. We do it because we say for public safety, but it just breeds abuse and corruption and that sort of stuff, not because the people who work there are inherently bad, but because bad systems create bad outcomes.
Right.
And so, I mean, do you find that in your work, that just the fact that you guys have a presence prevents things from going on that might otherwise go on?
Yeah, I believe that it does. I mean, I think you're exactly right. It goes back to the idea that these are completely closed systems, right, by design. And, what that means is, we don't know what's happening inside. We hear things, we learn things, but we don't know. And that's not okay. It's not okay because these are human beings who are inside. It's not okay because we spend billions of dollars on this. I mean, whether you come with your head, your heart, or your wallet, as we like to say at John Howard, you care about the issue for some reason. And yeah, I do think that there are things that are stopped in their tracks that are bad, or things that are improved because we show up. Not nearly enough things, to be very clear. But yeah, there is, we get enough letters from people and enough feedback that suggests, because we came, because we saw something and we mentioned it to a warden, something bad stopped, or something that wasn't happening started to happen again. They pay attention to people inherently tend to respond when they are being watched. Michelle made the point earlier. There is something about being held accountable that improves behavior, and that's just human nature. And so when you look at corrections, which really doesn't have that feature built into it because it's a closed system, you need people from the outside coming in to ask questions, to shine that light, to find out what's going on. And there is no doubt that the presence of outsiders, even those who are totally independent like us, makes people stop and think before they do something, or stop doing something they were doing. And I think that that's really important. It also helps us identify what things are happening inside that are not being talked about by the general public or by legislators. One of the things we did at John Howard that I'm incredibly proud of is champion the abolition of the $5 medical copay that we had in Illinois until January of 2020. And the reason we championed that issue is we heard from people inside, what a big deal it was, what a deterrent it was to their seeking preventative care. And forget the quality of medical care they're getting, because that's a whole, separate issue and conversation on its own, but just the access point. And so, we drilled down on that, and we spent a couple of years fighting for it until we could get it abolished. That is something else that people coming from the outside in can do, is help determine, what things aren't being talked about that should be talked about.
Yeah, Lillian, I want to ask you something. You and I have never talked about this. A lot of the opposition that we're talking about is people who may be perceived as tough on crime or just uncaring, and they don't think about the prison system. They don't have a loved one in it, and they don't think about it. Then there's the other side that we have to convince, which is people who do care about criminal justice reform, but view it only as decarceration and wanting to reduce prison budgets because they think they're going to starve the beast by cutting spending for prisons, and then magically lawmakers are going to start closing them. And that really bothers me a lot, I have to say, because that is the privilege of not having someone in prison that you love. It is easy for everybody to sit on the sidelines and wait for abolition or massive decarceration for 40, 50 years. But if your loved one is in there right now, you want to make sure that they are fed, that they're not freezing or boiling to death in a hot Texas prison. And yet, even in the criminal justice reform movement, there's this look at oversight as if, oh, well, that's not what we're for, because I'm just focused on getting people out of prison. Well, so are we. So are we. We've been doing it for 30 years. We are trying to get people out of prison, but we're not going to do it tonight. And it's on us to achieve that. But when we started working on oversight, the families that we all deal with and you deal with were so happy, because that's their immediate concern. A lot of the sentencing reforms we're going to pass and stuff aren't going to affect their loved ones unless they're retroactive. They need help now. They're worried about their loved ones dying in prison. And this view of, well, I don't want to work on that because I don't want to prop up the carceral state.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that, Lillian, as somebody who has a husband in prison, about the idea of let's just wait until we can reduce prison population?
What happens is, and I'm pretty sure it's happening not only in Arizona but in some other states, it's like there is a lot of misinformation. A common citizen will think that people in prison are in good conditions. They think that they are being housed properly, that they are being fed properly, that they have their 3 meals, and that they have free medical service. And there's a huge difference from what we know. We know that in Arizona, our prisoners are being fed meat that is labeled not suitable for human consumption. So pretty much our loved ones are eating what we as families are able to send them when they can purchase commissary, because most of them are not even eating the food that is being served in prison. The lack of medical care is imminent in Arizona. We see people that have cancer or they have any other terminal illness, and they're being just treated with ibuprofen or Tylenol. So I believe the misinformation is what is allowing us to be this bad in the state, that nobody cares because, like you said, they don't have a loved one in prison and they really don't care about the situation. But something that every citizen should care is about how the tax monies are being spent. And in this case, the Department of Correction gets a lot of money, a lot of the budget of the state goes to the prison. And it's not fair that we are seeing that they're not using it appropriately. So if you don't care about the prison conditions, care about your tax dollars and show some respect about the families that are dealing with a loved one in prison, and start getting informed, because this is real and it is happening.
Kevin, can I add something to this? In response to your question about people who want to see abolition, don't want to see anything invested in improving conditions, I believe that being able to decarcerate depends on seeing the people inside as human beings, right? Until you can see the humanity of people inside, you're not going to ever be inclined to decarcerate.
Right.
And oversight is one way to increase our understanding of people who are incarcerated as people. I think that as we enhance that understanding, as we learn to treat people with dignity and respect inside, it changes our views about whether they even need to be there. So the two go hand in hand. And I think it's absolutely essential that we have the oversight piece to go with the decarceration piece.
Jenny, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, thank you. Kevin, I do face the same questions that you articulated around efforts to decarcerate and prison abolition. And aren't we just propping that up? You know, that somehow by providing oversight and fighting for resources for the people who are currently incarcerated, you know, we're part of the problem. In fact, we are one of the few groups outside the Illinois Department of Corrections who shows up at appropriations hearings, because we're well aware of what it takes to improve things inside and the costs of things. And we want to see things improved for the people who are in prison right here, right now. And what I'd say is these goals are not incompatible. You're talking about short-term versus long-term. You're talking about immediate versus big picture. And in the immediate, prisons are not going away. I might want them to, you might want them to, but they're not. And we at the John Howard Association are unwilling to forego the immediate, to, you know, the reality of the lives being lived in prison right now and what those conditions are like and what that treatment is. And so, you know, what I have said sort of cavalierly to people that raise that in Illinois is, well, it sounds to me like you haven't been to a prison in Illinois, if you think that.
Yeah.
So I think there is room to work on both fronts. We certainly believe in decarceration. We believe in a much smaller system.
Yeah.
And as I said, a system that's humane. You know, we've all talked about Norway as a model, but looking to, you know, some of the European models that really, truly rehabilitate people and help them go forward differently rather than relying on pure incapacitation and retribution, you know, and hoping things turn out better once the person is released.
Yeah, no, it's always frustrating to me because, you know, in Florida and Texas, where those people are boiling during the summers, I would want them to have air conditioning, and that may cost a little bit of money, but I would do that. And I just think I worked on Capitol Hill when Republicans were trying to, you know, they were trying to cut taxes, and they were failing to win votes. So instead, they were trying to cut the budget of the IRS. The idea was, you know, we'll cut this terrible agency that we all hate. We'll cut their budget. Well, all that did was reduce tax collections, right? So like, it didn't help. And so starving the beast rarely works. And when we just say we're going to starve the prison system, we're going to actually starve the prisoners.
Right.
We're going to starve them of not only food but programming, of safety. So I just think it's a privileged position to say, you know, for my ideological end, I'm going to do this. But in the meantime, a lot of people are going to suffer. And so I just think even if our prisons, if I could cut the prison population in half tomorrow, I would, and I'd still want oversight for the 50% that were still in there. We're at the end, so I'm going to ask you all, we always do this. I just want to go around, give you a chance, take a minute or two for something I maybe didn't ask you or that you want to address. And on the front end, let me just thank you all again for being here. I'll start with you, Lillian.
Thank you, Kevin. In Arizona, we need oversight because we as family members, we want to know that our loved ones in prison are being able to do their sentence or their time in a safely manner and peacefully. That will give us family members a peace of mind. Just let them do their sentence in a safe place.
Well, thanks. And I'm gonna plug again, text Oversight to 21333 if you're in Arizona. The bill is actually going to be held over till Monday, so you have more time to call. So please, if you're in Arizona, there you go. Look at this. We're fancy. Take that action that you see on your screen. Jenny.
I want to thank you and Lillian and Michelle for having this conversation, for increasing the conversation around oversight. I think it's so important for people to get a better understanding of what it is, what it can be, what it does. There isn't a jail, prison, detention center, any closed facility in the United States that shouldn't have some form of oversight. We need to know what's happening inside every facility. And to the extent that the John Howard Association can be a resource or a partner to any group out there that's exploring this kind of work, I hope you'll find us. We're easily located, as we're always happy to share what we do and be of support to any group looking to do similar work.
I would want to ask you, is there a pending bill or effort right now to get the ombuds that you were talking about?
There is a pending bill. Representative Rita Mayfield has filed a bill to create an Office of Correctional Ombudsman. Last year, the same bill was filed and didn't move. As you know, or may not know, we just had a huge omnibus criminal justice reform package pass in Illinois that we're still kind of digging out from. It's fabulous, and the governor signed it into law on Monday. So it's unclear what other reform pieces will move forward in the next session, but the bill has been filed, and we're very grateful to Representative Mayfield for her leadership on this.
We'll make sure we have that so we can get our members to take action.
Absolutely.
And let me go to the godmother. Michelle, thank you for all that you do. Thanks for taking, you've participated in a number of state-specific forums we've done on this topic. And I think you explained it so well. So let's end with you.
Well, it's my pleasure to be part of this discussion. I've been working on these issues for a very long time. And what I have seen in the last few years is so much momentum around these issues. I think oversight is an idea whose time has come. And there's so much recognition in so many states right now that we need to make it happen. I think the COVID situation has laid bare the incredible need to find out what's going on in our institutions. It has shown how vulnerable people who are incarcerated and, frankly, people who work in these institutions are. And oversight is not a panacea, but it is absolutely essential to any effort to improve what's happening in our criminal justice system. And I thank FAMM for its efforts to promote it. And I'm grateful to my co-panelists for being so articulate and passionate in their support of these issues. So thank you all for being part of this discussion.
Yeah, and I'll just close by thanking you all again. It was great to have you here. I just want to reiterate, because FAMM it does nationally what Lillian is doing in Arizona. And it really depends. This is an area where families are the experts. They know what's going on inside. They can be the best advocates for their loved ones. And so, as she said, you just have to raise your voice. I know it can be hard at times, but you have the information. And so, sort of stay involved. Please follow us at famm.org. If you're not a member already, you can text FAMM to 21333. And we'll see you next week for another edition of the Heart to Heart series.